Rule number 6 from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. This section is titled Vengeance or Transformation. A religious man might shake his fist in desperation at the apparent injustice and blindness of God. Even Christ himself felt abandoned before the cross, or so the story goes. A more agnostic or atheistic individual might blame fate or meditate bitterly on the brutality of chance. Another might tear himself apart, searching for the character flaws underlying his suffering and deterioration. These are all variations on a theme. The name of the target changes, but the underlying psychology remains constant. Why? Why is there so much suffering and cruelty? Well, perhaps it really is God's doing, or the fault of blind, pointless fate, if you are inclined to think that way, and there appears to be every reason to think that way. But what happens if you do? Mass murderers believe that the suffering attendant upon existence justifies judgment and revenge, as the column boys so clearly indicated. I will sooner die than betray my own thoughts. Before I leave this worthless place, I will kill whoever I deem unfit for anything, especially life. If you pissed me off in the past, you will die if I see you. You might be able to piss off others and have it eventually all blow over, but not me. I don't forget people who wronged me. One of the most vengeful murderers of the 20th century, the terrible Carl Panzeram, was raped, brutalized, and betrayed in the Minnesota institution responsible for his rehabilitation. When he was a delinquent juvenile, he emerged enraged beyond measure as burglar, arsonist, rapist, and serial killer. He aimed consciously and consistently at destruction, even keeping track of the dollar value of the property he burned. He started by hating the individuals who had hurt him. His resentment grew until his hatred encompassed all of mankind. And he didn't stop there. His destructiveness was aimed in some fundamental manner of God himself. There is no other way of phrasing it. Panzeram raped, murdered, and burned to express his outrage of being. He acted as if someone was responsible. The same thing happens in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain's sacrifices are rejected. He exists in suffering. He calls out God and challenges the being he created. God refuses his plea. He tells Cain that his trouble is self-induced. Cain, in his rage, kills Abel, God's favorite, and, truth be known, Cain's idol. Cain is jealous, of course, of his successful brother, but he destroys Abel primarily to spite God. This is the truest version of what happens when people take their vengeance to the ultimate extreme. Panzeram's response was, and this is what was so terrible, perfectly understandable. The details of his autobiography reveal that he was one of Tolstoy's strong and logical, consistent people. He was a powerful, consistent, fearless actor. He had the courage of his convictions. How could someone like him be expected to forgive and forget, given what had happened to him? Truly terrible things happen to people. It's no wonder they're out for revenge. Under such conditions, vengeance seems a moral necessity. How can it be distinguished from the demand for justice? After the experience of terrible atrocity, isn't forgiveness just cowardice or lack of willpower? Such questions torment me, but people emerge from terrible pasts to do good and not evil, although such an accomplishment can seem superhuman. So just because somebody had a terrible past and had bad things happen to them doesn't mean that they're going to act that way upon other people. And if they don't, that does not make them weak either. That makes them strong. I have met people who managed to do it. I know a man, a great artist, who emerged from such a school as one described by Panzeram. Only this man was thrown in as an innocent 5-year-old, fresh from a long stretch in a hospital where he had suffered measles, mumps, and chickenpox simultaneously, incapable of speaking the language of the school, deliberately isolated from his family, abused, starved, and otherwise tormented. He emerged an angry, broken young man. He hurt himself badly in the aftermath of drugs and alcohol and other forms of self-destructive behavior. He detested everyone, God, himself, and blind fate included. But he put an end to all that. He stopped drinking. He stopped hating, although it still emerges in flashes. He revitalized the artistic culture of the native tradition and trained young men to continue in his footsteps. He produced a 50-foot totem pole memorializing the events of his life in a canoe 40 feet long from a single log of a kind rarely if ever produced now. He brought his family together and held a great potluck With 16 hours of dancing and hundreds of people in attendance to express his grief and make peace with the past, he decided to be a good person and then did the impossible things required to live that way. I had a client who did not have good parents. Her mother died when she was very young. Her grandmother, who raised her, was hardened, bitter, and over-concerned with appearances. She mistreated her granddaughter, punishing her for her virtues, creativity, sensitivity, and intelligence. Unable to resist acting out her resentment for an admittingly hard life of her granddaughter, she had a better relationship with her father, but he was an addict who died badly while she cared for him. My client had a son. She perpetuated none of this with him. He grew up truthful and independent and hardworking and smart. Instead of widening the tear to the cultural fabric she inherited and transmitting it, she sewed it up. She rejected the sins of her forefathers. Such things can be done. Distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. He uses the word nihilism and nihilist a lot in there. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Nietzsche wrote these words. What he meant was this: people who experience evil may certainly desire to perpetuate it and pay it forward, but it is also possible to learn good by experiencing evil. A bullied boy can mimic his tormentors, but he can also learn from his own abuse that it is wrong to push people around and to make their lives miserable. Someone tormented by her mother can learn from her terrible experiences how important it is to be a good parent. Many, perhaps even most, of the adults who abuse children were abused themselves as children. However, the majority of people who are abused as children do not abuse their own children. This is a well-established fact, and it can be demonstrated simply, arithmetically, in this way. If one parent abused 3 children, and each of those children had 3 children and so on, then there would be 3 abusers the first generation, 9 the second, 27 the third, 81 the fourth, and so on exponentially. Yep. After 20 generations, more than 10 billion would have suffered child abuse. More people than currently inhabit the planet. But instead, abuse disappears across generations. People constrain its spread. That's a testament to the genuine dominance of good over evil in the human heart. Yeah, I was severely abused. I'm not gonna ever, if I have children, I'm not ever gonna abuse them. That's a fact. The desire for vengeance, however unjustified, also bars the way to other productive thoughts. The American-English poet T.S. Eliot explained why in his play The Cocktail Party. One of his characters is not having a good time of it. She speaks of her profound unhappiness to a psychiatrist. She says she hopes that all her suffering is her own fault. The psychiatrist is taken aback. He asks why. She has thought long and hard about this, she says, and has come to the following conclusion. If it's her fault, she might be able to do something about it. If it's God's fault, however, in reality, itself is flawed. Hell-bent on ensuring her misery, then she is doomed. She couldn't change the structure of reality itself, but maybe she could change her own life. Good point. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had a reason to question the structure of existence when he was imprisoned at a Soviet labor camp. Let's just call him Alex Solzhenitsyn. He had served as a soldier on the ill-prepared Russian front lines in the face of a Nazi invasion. He had been arrested, beaten, and thrown into prison by his own people. Wow. Then he was struck by cancer. He could have become resentful and bitter. His life had been rendered miserable by both Stalin and Hitler, 2 of the worst tyrants in history. He lived in brutal conditions. Vast stretches of his precious time were stolen from him and squandered. He witnessed the pointless and degrading suffering and death of his friends and acquaintances. Then he contracted an extremely serious disease. Solzhenitsyn had cause to curse God. Job himself barely had it. It's hard. But the great writer, the profound spirited defender of truth, did not allow his mind to turn towards vengeance and destruction. He opened his eyes instead. During his many trials, he encountered people who comported themselves nobly under horrific circumstances. He contemplated their behavior deeply. Then he asked himself the most difficult of questions. Had he personally contributed to the catastrophe of his own life? Like he's in the prison camp. Like, is this at all his fault? If so, how? He remembered his unquestioning support of the Communist Party in his early years. He reconsidered his whole life. He had plenty of time in the camps. How had he missed the mark in the past? How many times had he acted against his own conscience, engaging in actions that he knew to be wrong? How many times had he betrayed himself and lied? Was there any way that the sins of the past could be rectified, atoned for, in the muddy hell of a Soviet gulag? Solzhenitsyn pored over the details of his life with a fine-toothed comb. I've done the exact same thing. He asked himself a second question and a third. Can I stop making such mistakes now? Can I repair the damage done by my past failures now? Well, he learned to watch and to listen. He found people he admired who were honest despite everything. He took himself apart piece by piece, let what was unnecessary and harmful die, and resurrected himself. Then he wrote The Gulag Archipelago, a history of the Soviet prison camp system. It's a forceful, terrible book written with the overwhelming moral force of an unvarnished truth. Its sheer outrage screamed unbearably across hundreds of pages. Banned, and for good reason, in the USSR, it was smuggled into the West in the 1970s and burst upon the world. Solzhenitsyn's writing utterly and finally demolished the intellectual credibility of communism as an ideology or society. He took an axe to the trunk of the tree whose bitter fruits had nourished him so poorly, and whose planting he had witnessed and supported. One man's decision to change his life instead of cursing fate shook the whole pathological system of communism tyranny to its core. It crumbled entirely, not so many years later, and Solzhenitsyn's courage was not the least of the reasons why. He was not the only such person to perform such a miracle. Václav Havel, the persecuted writer who later, and possibly, became the president of Czechoslovakia, then of the new Czech Republic, comes to mind, as does Mahatma Gandhi. That was 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. That was from the beginning of rule number 6. My name is Gregory Brandt. If you enjoyed my reading, check out my other videos. Check out my own book. It's called Gonzo Education. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thank you. Have a nice day.